I still tremble when I close my eyes and remember that face. It wasn't an ordinary human face, it was a map of ancient pain and an evil that has no beginning and no end. I saw Cain in hell, and what I witnessed left me scarred forever, not on my skin, but in the deepest part of my soul. Many believe that the story of the first murderer is just an ancient legend or a tale to scare children in Sunday school. But I'm here to tell you that it's real as the air you're breathing right now, and as real as the hatred you may be harboring in your heart against someone. I thought I was a good man. I never picked up a knife to hurt anyone, I never fired a gun, I never robbed a bank. But I learned the hard way that hatred in the heart weighs as much on the hands as blood on the hands in God's eyes, and it was that silent, cold hatred that dragged me into the abyss before I could realize my mistake. My name is irrelevant now, but my story is an urgent warning to you. It all began in a small office that smelled of stale coffee and old papers. My brother and I were sitting across from the family lawyer, just 3 days after burying our father. The pain of the loss was still fresh, but something much darker than sadness was beginning to grow in my chest. When the lawyer read the will, I felt as if I'd been slapped across the face. My father had decided to divide the inheritance in a way I considered unfair, to my younger brother, the one who had always been the favorite, the one who never worked as hard as I did in the family business. He left the big house and the most of the land to me, who had sacrificed my weekends and my youth working shoulder to shoulder with Dad. He left a sum of money that seemed like an insult and a remote plot of land that was worthless. At that precise moment, something broke inside me. I looked at my brother and no longer saw the boy I used to play ball with in the yard, nor the young man I helped with his homework. I saw a thief. I saw an enemy. He tried to approach me as he left the office, tears in his eyes, wanting to hug me for the loss of our father, but I recoiled as if I had a contagious disease. I remember his exact words when he told me he didn't care about the money, that we could work things out, that all he wanted was for us to remain a family, but my ears were closed. He had already planted the seed of envy in my mind, and I foolishly decided to water it every day. I told him not to speak to me, to enjoy his theft, and that as far as I was concerned, he had died along with our father. Those words came out of my mouth with an ease that frightened me, but I felt powerful saying them. I didn't know I was signing my own death warrant. The following months were a downward spiral. Hate is a poison, curious because you take it hoping the other person will die, but the only one who dies is yourself. I became obsessed with my brother's life. I spent sleepless nights imagining how he enjoyed what, in my opinion, belonged to me by right. If I found out he had bought a new car, my stomach churned with rage. If I saw him smiling in a family photo to which I was no longer invited, I felt a fire in my chest that made it hard to breathe. I stopped going to church because I couldn't bear the hypocrisy of singing about love while wishing harm upon my own flesh and blood. My wife tried to reason with me. She told me that money wasn't worth it, that we were losing the peace in our home because of my bitterness. But I silenced her with shouts. No one could understand me. I was the victim. I was the martyr. I became an expert at justifying my sin. I told myself I had a right to be angry, that justice was on my side. I began to isolate myself from my friends, my cousins, from anyone who dared suggest I should forgive. Forgiveness seemed like a word for the weak, for fools who let themselves be trampled on. I wasn't going to be weak. I was going to stand my ground to the end, even if it cost me my life, and it almost cost me much more than my physical life. My health began to deteriorate rapidly. The constant anger kept my blood pressure through the roof. I had headaches that made me urinate, heartburn that no medicine could soothe, and chronic fatigue that made me drag my feet. My body was screaming what my spirit already knew, that I was rotting from the inside out. I remember one afternoon in particular, a grey and rainy Sunday. My mother, who was already very old and frail, called me on the phone. Her voice trembled, and she begged me to come to Christmas dinner, saying my brother would be there and she didn't want to die seeing her 2 sons fighting. She told me life is short, that pride leads to nothing good. My heart, hard as stone, told her that as long as he was there, I wouldn't set foot in that house. I told her she had chosen his side by allowing that injustice in the will. I heard her crying on the other end of the line, a soft, painful cry of a mother watching her son slip away. Instead of being moved, I felt irritated. I hung up the phone sharply, feeling justified in my anger. I didn't know that would be the last time I would hear her voice. Bitterness became my constant companion, my shadow, my identity. I was no longer the cheerful man I used to be, the loving father, the attentive husband. I was a man consumed by unfinished business. I would wake up thinking about him and fall asleep thinking about him. It was a malignant obsession. I started having horrible nightmares, where shadows chased me, where I ran through endless hallways without finding a way out. But when I woke up, reality was worse. The reality was that I was living in a prison I had built myself, brick by brick, and the saddest thing is that I held the key in my hand. The key was forgiveness, but I had thrown it away, to the bottom of the ocean of my pride. I even came to actively wish him harm. I remember walking past the house he inherited, the house where we grew up, and looking at the lit windows with deep contempt. I thought horrible things. I thought that I hoped he would lose everything, that I hoped he would get sick, that I hoped he would suffer as much as I felt he was suffering. The Bible says that whoever hates their brother is a murderer and that no murderer has eternal life in him. I didn't know that verse then, or if I did, I conveniently ignored it, but I was committing spiritual murder every day. I was killing my brother in my mind over and over again, and each time I did, a part of my own soul grew a little darker, preparing for the terrible fate that awaited me just around the corner. The atmosphere in my own house became unbearable. My children stopped speaking to me, frightened by my explosive temper. My wife slept in the guest room. I was left alone with my reason, alone with my money, only with my own sense of justice. But inside I was empty, hollow, dry like a dead leaf ready to be burned. I didn't realize I was walking on the edge of a precipice and that I was blindfolded. I thought I had all the time in the world to fix things, or perhaps I thought I would never fix them and that I would die with my pride intact. But God has ways of stopping us, and sometimes when we don't hear the whisper of love, we have to face the scream of judgment. The day my heart stopped beating, I wasn't at peace, I wasn't praying, I was in the midst of the greatest fury I had ever felt. Time passed, and my heart became a block of ice. What at first was a hot, explosive rage transformed into a cold, calculated resentment that followed me everywhere. I strayed so far from the light that the darkness began to seem normal and comfortable. My lifelong friends stopped calling me because they said my conversations always ended in complaints and venom against my family. I stayed alone in my office, surrounded by papers and invoices, believing that my financial success would be the best revenge against my brother. I thought that if I managed to have more money than him, then I would win that imaginary competition that only existed in my sick mind. I worked 18 hours a day so I wouldn't have to think, so I wouldn't have to feel the emptiness that was eating me up inside. But money didn't buy peace, and every coin I earned seemed to mock me. One day, the pastor of my old church came to visit me at my workplace. He was an old and wise man, with eyes that seemed to see beyond appearances. He saw me thin, with deep dark circles under my eyes and a tension in my jaw that was now permanent. He sat down across from me and didn't talk to me about religion or complicated theology. He just looked at me with compassion and said something that haunted me for a long time. He told me that forgiveness is the key that unlocks the soul from the inside, and that I was both the prisoner and the jailer. He warned me that hatred is like drinking poison and hoping the other person dies. I laughed in his face. I told him I didn't need his sermons, that I was right, and that God knew I had been treated unfairly. The pastor stood up sadly, dusted his shoes, and before leaving, told me he would pray that God would have mercy on my soul before it was too late. I slammed the door, feeling victorious, but my hands were shaking uncontrollably. That night I had a dream that should have been a final warning. I dreamt I was walking through a barren desert under a black sun that burned my skin. I was unbearably thirsty, my tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth, and my lips were chapped. In the distance, I saw a fountain of crystal clear water where my brother stood smiling and offering me a glass. But every time I tried to run toward the water, my feet sank into the hot sand. and heavy chains pulled my ankles back. The chains had names written on rusty iron links: pride, envy, resentment, hatred. I awoke drenched in a cold sweat, my heart pounding in my ribs as if it wanted to escape my chest. Instead of kneeling and asking God for help, I got up and poured myself a glass of hard liquor to calm my nerves. I stiffened my glass once more. The morning of my death dawned with a stifling heat, unusually hot for that time of year. The air was heavy, and it was hard to breathe, like as if the atmosphere itself were charged with static electricity. I woke up with a throbbing headache behind my eyes, but I ignored it as I did everything else. I went to my business and found that an important machine had broken down, which meant lost money. My mood, already dark, turned violent. I started yelling at my employees, berating them for their incompetence, unloading all the frustration I had been building up for months. I saw the fear in their eyes, and that, in some twisted way, made me feel powerful. I felt like a king in my little kingdom of terror, unaware that my crown was about to fall. Around noon, the door to my office opened, and he walked in. My brother. I hadn't seen him in person since the day at the lawyer's office. It had been almost a year. He looked different, older perhaps, but there was a peace on his face that instantly enraged me. How dare he have peace after what he had done to me? How dare he come to my territory uninvited? He stood in front of my desk and placed a white envelope on the wood. He told me in a calm voice that he didn't want to fight anymore. He explained that he had decided to sell me the portion of land I wanted for a symbolic price, almost a gift, because for him, family was worth more than any hectare of land. He told me that he missed me and wanted his children to meet their uncle. Anyone in their right mind would have seen that gesture as a white flag, a golden opportunity to reconcile and reclaim their lost life, but I wasn't in my right mind. I was drunk with pride. My mind twisted his words and his intentions. I didn't see generosity, I saw pity. I felt that he was humiliating me, that he was rubbing it in my face, that he could afford to give things away while I had to work hard. The blood rushed to my head so fast I felt a ringing in my ears. I jumped to my feet, slamming my fists on the table. My face must have been as red as crimson. I yelled at him that I didn't want his artwork, I didn't want his pity, and that he should get out of my sight with his dirty money. He tried to speak, raising his hands in a gesture of peace, but I wouldn't let him. I began to say the most hurtful things I could find in the depths of my bitterness. I reminded him of past mistakes. I invented offenses that never happened. I attacked his character, his faith, and his family. Every word that came out of my mouth was like a dagger seeking blood. I felt a strange pressure in my chest, as if a giant hand were squeezing my heart, but the adrenaline of anger was so strong that I didn't stop. I wanted to hurt him. I wanted to see him cry. I wanted seeing him destroyed. I screamed at him that I wished he were dead, that I wished he'd never been born, and at that moment, just as that curse left my lips, I felt a sharp snap inside me, as if a taut string had finally broken. The world around me began to spin slowly. My brother's face, which had gone from hope to horror, began to blur. The sound of my own voice echoed in my head like a distant echo. I felt a sudden heat rising from my stomach to my throat, a fire that wasn't normal. My legs, which seconds before had held me with arrogant firmness, turned into jelly. I leaned on the desk to keep from falling, gasping for air, but no air was coming in. It was as if someone had turned off the oxygen in the entire room. My brother ran toward me, shouting my name in desperation, forgetting all the insults I had just hurled at him. He grabbed my arms just as my knees buckled. I wanted to push him away. I wanted to tell him to let go, not to touch me, but my body no longer obeyed my mind. The pain exploded in the center of my chest with the force of a speeding truck. It wasn't a sharp pain, it was an absolute crushing weight, as if the roof of the building had collapsed onto my ribs. My left arm went completely numb and I felt a metallic taste in my mouth. I looked at my brother and saw tears running down his cheeks as he pulled out his phone to call an ambulance. I tried to speak, I tried to say something, maybe a final curse or maybe a plea for help, I don't know, but only a muffled gurgle came out. The darkness began to eat away at the edges of my vision. closing the tunnel of light until only his frightened face remained, and then I knew with absolute terror that it wasn't fainting. I was dying filled with hatred. If this story is touching your heart, if something inside you is stirring, stay with me and take a moment to subscribe to the channel. This isn't just a video, it's an encounter with God that can change your eternal destiny. The darkness that enveloped me wasn't simply the absence of light, it was something solid and heavy, like a lead blanket. The noise of the world, my brother's shouts, the hum of the office air conditioner, everything cut off abruptly, as if someone had unplugged the universe, for an instant, which seemed eternal. There was absolute silence, a silence so profound it hurt, and the strangest thing was that the physical pain disappeared, that unbearable pressure in my chest, the tingling in my arm, the shortness of breath, it all vanished in a fraction of a second. I felt light, terribly light, like a feather floating in the void. For a brief, ridiculous moment, I thought I had fainted and was dreaming, but the clarity of my mind was too sharp to make a dream. I had never been so awake in my entire life as I was at that moment. Then my vision returned, but I wasn't seeing through my physical eyes. I was floating near the ceiling of my own office. Looking down, the scene I saw sent a chill down my spine that was not of this world. I saw a body lying on the floor, its face purple, its eyes wide and glazed, staring into nothingness. It took me a few horrible seconds to recognize that this inert lump of flesh was me. I saw my brother, the man I had just cursed with my last breath, kneeling over my corpse. He was weeping desperately, pounding on my chest, trying to make me breathe, screaming my name in a voice broken with pain. I saw my employees rush in, panic on their faces, chaos unfolding, but I felt none of it. I felt no pity for my body, nor gratitude for my brother's effort. All I felt was a strange, cold indifference, mixed with that same rage that had killed me, even outside my body. My spirit remained tainted with hatred. I tried to scream, tried to tell them I was up there, but I had no voice, no mouth. I was pure consciousness, pure existence without matter. And then, real fear, it began. I didn't see a bright light at the end of a tunnel. I didn't see deceased relatives coming to greet me with smiles. I didn't hear celestial music. What I felt was a presence behind me, or perhaps beneath me. I can't explain it in human terms. It was a gravitational pull, but not physical, rather spiritual. I felt as if an invisible hook had sunk into my back and was pulling me backward, away from the office scene. I wanted to resist. I wanted to grab onto the ceiling lights, the walls, anything, but my hands passed through matter as if it were smoke. The suction force was irresistible and violent. Suddenly, the ceiling, the office, and my brother disappeared. I was dragged at breakneck speed into a darkness that seemed to have a life of its own. It was like falling down a bottomless pit, but falling backward, without knowing where I would land. The sensation of falling was so real that I felt vertigo in my very core, and as I fell, the temperature began to change drastically. The deathly chill gave way to a suffocating heat, a dry, harsh heat that reminded me of the inside of an industrial oven. The air, if it could be called air, became thick and foul-smelling. I began to smell something I will never forget as long as I live. The smell of sulfur mixed with rot, like decomposing meat and burnt garbage. It was a stench that not only entered through my nose but permeated my soul, making me feel dirty and contaminated. As I descended through that throat of darkness, I began to hear sounds. At first, they were distant murmurs, like the buzzing of a swarm of angry bees, but as I fell deeper, the murmurs turned into screams. They weren't cries of fright, they were shrieks of pure terror, wails of eternal pain, and blood-curdling howls of despair. I heard human voices, millions of them overlapping one another in a cacophony of suffering. At that moment, the realization hit me like a giant hammer. I was dead, and I wasn't going to heaven. The panic I felt was indescribable. I, who had gone to church, who knew the hymns, who had tithed when it suited me, was falling into hell. My mind frantically searched for an explanation, an excuse. This is a mistake, I thought. I'm not a murderer, I'm not a rapist, I'm a businessman, a respectable man. But in that darkness, The lies we tell ourselves on earth are useless. The truth shone with cruel clarity. I remembered every insult to my brother, every moment of resentment, every time I hardened my heart. I understood that my respectability was a mask and that my true face was one of hatred, and hatred has no place in the realm of light. I kept falling, and the darkness filled with moving shadows, grotesque shapes that brushed past me, whispering my name mockingly. I felt claws trying to grab me, grazing my being, promising me torment. The fall ended abruptly. I didn't land on solid ground, but was suspended in a vast and terrifying place. The darkness here wasn't total, it was tinged with a red and orange glow that came from everywhere and nowhere, as if the air itself were on fire. My spiritual eyes adjusted to the gloom, and what I saw made me wish I could cease to exist. I was on an immense plain, barren and rocky, stretching as far as the eye could see. There was no water. There were no trees, no blue sky. The sky was a dome of thick smoke and storm clouds that flashed with blood-red lightning. The ground was cracked, and hot steam rose from the fissures, but the worst part wasn't the landscape, it was the inhabitants. Everywhere I looked, I saw souls, naked, grayish human figures, wandering aimlessly, writhing on the ground, running back and forth like caged animals, and among them, walking with authority and cruelty, were demons. They were nightmarish beings, some gigantic, others small and deformed, all emanating an evil so pure it made me tremble. I realized that I, too, was naked, exposed, vulnerable. I didn't have my expensive suit, I didn't have my money, I didn't have my pride. I was just a miserable soul in the midst of damnation. Fear paralyzed me. I wanted to hide, to find a rock behind which to take refuge. But there was nowhere to hide. Everything was exposed before the eyes of evil. I felt a loneliness so profound that it was physical. On earth, even in the worst moments, one has the hope that tomorrow will be another day, that things can get better. There, in that first instant, I knew that hope didn't exist. That word had been erased from the dictionary. The feeling of forever settled in my mind like a burning ember. This wasn't a nightmare from which I would wake up sweating. This was my new reality. This was my home. Suddenly, one of the creatures patrolling nearby stopped. It turned its deformed head toward where I was. It had yellow eyes like a reptile's and a mouthful of sharp teeth that drooled a black liquid. It sniffed me. I could see its nostrils flare. It knew I was a newcomer. A macabre smile spread across his face, and he began to walk toward me. He wasn't running, he was walking slowly, savoring my terror. I wanted to back away, but my feet seemed glued to the scorching ground. The demon drew near until his fetid breath struck my face. He looked at me with infinite contempt and spoke in a voice that sounded like stones being crushed. He said, "Welcome, hater, we were expecting you, your place is ready," and with a claw as cold and hard as steel, he grabbed my arm and dragged me deeper into the abyss, toward where the screams were loudest. The demon's claw closed on my arm with the force of a hydraulic press, crushing what on earth would have been my bones and muscles, but there was a spiritual substance capable of feeling a pain 1,000 times more acute. He didn't lead me gently, he dragged me like a worthless sack of garbage. My bare feet pounded against the sharp stones of the infernal ground, tearing with every meter we advanced, but the wound didn't bleed red, vital blood. Instead, it oozed a kind of grayish smoke that smelled of despair. I screamed, begged for mercy, tried to cling to the cracks in the ground with my free hand, breaking my nails in a futile attempt to halt my fate, but the creature didn't even flinch. It advanced with cruel determination, humming a discordant, mocking melody, savoring every second of my useless resistance. We crossed plains where I saw things my mind refuses to fully describe for fear of losing its mind again. I saw lakes of boiling mud where human heads surfaced, gasping for air. I saw forests of withered trees whose branches were actually petrified human arms, contorted in gestures of supplication, but the demon didn't stop in any of those places. I had a specific destination planned for me, a place tailor-made for my sin. The landscape began to change as we descended a steep slope into a deep, narrow canyon. Black rock walls rose on either side, blocking what little visibility there was and creating a deafening echo. The heat here became humid and sticky, infused with an unmistakable metallic smell, the smell of fresh and old blood, mingled with the acrid stench of fear-induced sweat. We reached the edge of what looked like a gigantic fighting arena, a valley sunk between mountains of darkness. The demon lifted me into the air with one hand and held me over the precipice so I could see clearly what was happening below. What my eyes beheld made me want to vomit. The valley was filled with millions of souls, but they weren't being tortured by demons with whips or fire. They were torturing each other. It was a sea of unrestrained violence, a tumult of bodies entwined in an eternal and ferocious struggle, men against men, women against women, young against old. They punched each other, bit each other, scratched each other's faces with a fury that seemed endless. There was no rest, no truce, only an infinite cycle of attack and pain. The demon brought his hideous face close to mine and whispered in my ear with that voice of gravel and poison. He told me to watch closely, to look at the faces of the combatants. I forced my gaze downward, horrified. I saw two men rolling on the ground, one trying to strangle the other with his bare hands while the other gouged his eyes out. The most terrifying thing was that they looked alike. They had the same nose, the same face shape. They were brothers. Further on, I saw a young woman screaming at an older woman while violently shaking her by the shoulders. They were mother and daughter. The entire valley was populated by people who in life shared the same last name, the same blood, the same roof, but who allowed hatred to tear them apart. "Welcome to the Valley of the Murderers at Heart," said the demon, letting out a laugh that echoed off the canyon walls. "There are no strangers here, there is only family. All of these people you see here came believing they were innocent, because they never used a gun or physical poison, but their tongues were swords and their thoughts were bullets. They hated their neighbor, they hated their own flesh and blood, and the law of heaven is clear. Anyone who hates their brother is a murderer." Those words struck me harder than any physical torture. On earth, I had rationalized my behavior. I had told myself that ignoring my brother wasn't killing him, that wishing him harm wasn't hurting him. But in hell, the truth is revealed without filters. I understood with absolute terror that for God, the intention of the heart is as real as the act of the hands. I had killed my brother thousands of times in my mind. Every time I refused to greet him, I killed him. Every time I felt joy at his troubles, I killed him. Every time I imagined his ruin, I plunged a dagger into his spirit. I was a spiritual serial killer, and this valley was my corresponding prison. The demon pointed to the two brothers who were fighting. He explained that they had been there for centuries. On Earth, they had fought over an inheritance, over a few meters of land that no longer existed. That time had erased, but his hatred had survived death and was now his only possession. They were doomed to repeat their dispute for all eternity, reliving the moment of their rupture again and again, with no possibility of reconciliation. "That is your future," the beast told me. "Soon you will join them, soon you will seek your brother in every shadow to unleash your rage, but you will never find him here, because he did not hate you, he forgave you, and that will be your greatest torment, knowing that he is in the light while you rot in your own fury." I felt a crushing weight of guilt. I remembered my brother's face in the office, weeping over my body, trying to save me despite my insults. I remembered his attempts at a hug, his letters, his calls. He had chosen love, and I had chosen pride. Now, the distance between us was not only physical, it was an unbridgeable chasm established by eternity. I wanted to cry, but in hell there are no tears of solace, only dry wails that tear at the throat. The demon reveled in my anguish, feeding on my despair as if it were a delicacy. He released me abruptly, and I tumbled down the slope toward the valley floor. The impact was brutal. I felt my very essence tremble. As I stood up, several nearby souls turned toward me. Their eyes were devoid of humanity, filled with a raging madness. They saw in me a new target to unleash their frustration. A group of them began to advance toward me, growling like wild animals. I backed away in terror, searching for a way out. But the walls were too high and smooth. I was trapped in the pit of the spiteful. I felt the first blow on my back, then another on my face. The pain was real, sharp, humiliating. I began to scream, to defend myself clumsily, feeling the same hatred that had brought me there begin to sprout anew, ready to consume me and make me one of them forever. But just when I thought I would be torn apart by the mob of furious souls, the demon that had brought me there let out a roar that paralyzed everyone. Souls stopped and retreated. Trembling, their heads bowed in their mission, the demon leapt down and landed in front of me. Dismissing the attackers with a dismissive gesture, he grabbed me again by the neck, lifting me off the ground until my feet dangled. I gasped, waiting for the final blow, but he shook his deformed head. "Not yet," he snarled, a malicious grin revealing his yellowed fangs. "You're not one of them yet, worm. You have a special appointment before you join the eternal dance. The Master wants you to see the origin of all this. He wants you to meet the first one who came here because of your very own sin. He wants you to see the father of brotherly hatred." I didn't understand what he meant, but the tone of his voice chilled me more than the infernal landscape itself. He dragged me out of the valley, leading me down a dark and lonely path that led away from the tumult. The noise of the fighting faded, replaced by a heavy, ominous silence that was even worse. We walked toward an area where the darkness seemed denser, more ancient. There was no fire here, only a sepulchral cold that pierced to the bone. In the distance, I saw a solitary figure sitting on a rock, isolated from everything and everyone. The solitude emanating from that figure was so immense it was almost palpable. "Prepare yourself," the demon whispered, pushing me forward. "You are going to meet Cain." The demon stopped abruptly about 50 meters from the seated figure, as if it had collided with an invisible wall of respect or fear. That creature, which moments before had displayed brutal arrogance and cruelly mocked my pain, now seemed shrunken and restless. Its claws nervously scraped the stone floor, and its yellow eyes avoided looking directly at the solitary shadow before us. He pushed me hard forward, but he remained rooted in his place, refusing to take another step into that secluded area. He told me with a low growl that my guidance ended there, that I had to walk the last few meters alone, because of the curse that surrounded that man. It was so ancient and heavy that even demons preferred not to get too close, lest they be crushed by its spiritual gravity. I stood there trembling in the absolute silence. Behind me lay the chaotic din of the Valley of the Resentful, the shouts, the blows, and the weeping. Here, nothing could be heard. There was no wind, no buzzing of infernal insects, not even the crunch of the earth beneath my feet seemed to make a sound. It was a dense and oppressive silence, an acoustic void that pressed against my eardrums until they ached. The air was icy, a dry cold that had nothing to do with temperature, but rather with the total absence of life and love. I felt I was entering the epicenter of human loneliness, ground zero where the tragedy of our species began. I began to walk slowly toward the figure. My legs barely responded, heavy as if they were made of lead. As I drew closer, I could make out the details of that man more clearly. He was sitting on a square, black rock that vaguely resembled an ancient altar, his back hunched and his head buried in his hands. He was enormous. His physical structure was imposing, much larger and more robust than that of any modern man I had ever seen. His shoulders were as broad as wooden beams, and his back displayed taut muscles beneath skin that looked like leather tanned by millennia of exposure to the elements and suffering. He wore no clothes, but his body was covered in a layer of dirt and ash that seemed to have fused with his flesh. The atmosphere around him vibrated with a strange energy. It wasn't heat, it was a kind of visual distortion, like when hot air rises from asphalt, but in this case, it was an emanation of deep, black sadness. Each step I took toward him was more difficult, as if I were walking against a gale of anguish. I felt a pressure in my chest that made it hard to breathe. A sense of vicarious guilt that clung to my skin. It was as if the air itself were heavy with the memory of an atrocious crime. When I was just a few steps away, I stopped. I didn't dare to speak. I didn't know what to say to the first human being who had crossed the forbidden line of taking the life of his own brother. He must have sensed my presence, or perhaps he smelled the sin I carried with me, because slowly, very slowly, he lifted his head from his hands. The movement was heavy and painful, like that of an ancient statue reluctantly coming to life. He turned on the rock to face me, and for the first time I saw Cain's face. It wasn't the face of a horned monster or a deformed beast, it was a terribly human face, and that was what frightened me most. He had strong, primitive features, a square jaw and a broad forehead, but his expression was a map of eternal desolation. His eyes were sunken in deep, dark basins, and when he looked at me, I felt him pierce right through me. There was no brightness in his pupils, no light, only endless wells of dead gray. They were the eyes of someone who had seen centuries and millennia pass without a single second of peace, someone who had forgotten what hope meant. His skin was furrowed with deep cracks, like the dry earth of a desert, and his long, tangled hair fell over his shoulders like a curtain of gray moss. But what made me instinctively recoil, what made me want to cover my face and run, was the mark. The Bible speaks of the mark God placed on Cain so that no one would kill him, and I always imagined it would be a scar, or a tattoo, but it was nothing like that. It was something much more terrifying. On his forehead, the skin seemed to move as if there was something alive beneath it. It was a pulsating shadow, a darkness that emanated from within him and projected outward. That mark conveyed a sense of untouchability, a divine warning that screamed separate. Seeing that mark filled me with a reverential terror, an instinctive fear of God's justice that does not forgive impenitence. Cain said nothing at first, he just looked at me, and in that look I felt the weight of his story. I didn't need anyone to confirm it. I knew I was standing before the eldest son of Adam and Eve. I was standing before the man who had walked the earth when the world was young, the man who had spoken with God before silence fell upon us. And I was standing before the man who, out of envy, unable to bear that his brother's offering was accepted and his own was not, had lifted a stone and spilled the first human blood on the ground. The impact of that reality struck my knees, and I fell to the ground. I felt small, ridiculous with my modern resentment and my cheap justifications. I had hated my brother for an inheritance, for money, for pride. Cain had invented that hatred. He was the architect of my prison. I felt a horrible connection with him, an invisible thread that bound my rotten heart to his. We were family in crime. He was the spiritual father of all who do not forgive. Then he opened his mouth. His lips were dry and cracked, and his voice sounded like the cracking of rocks crashing at the bottom of a cavern, a voice that hadn't been used in centuries, but that retained a terrifying authority. "Why are you here, son of dust?" he asked. And each word struck the air like a hammer. "You smell of your own blood, you smell of the envy that trots bones." I couldn't answer, my throat was closed by the knot of fear. He stood slowly, and his shadow lengthened over me, covering me completely. He was gigantic. He took a step closer, and the cold emanating from his body chilled me to the bone. "I know your heart," he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that was louder than a shout. "You looked at your brother and wished he didn't exist. You looked at his blessing and called it injustice. You believed that by extinguishing his light, yours would shine brighter. Fool." He crouched down until his face was inches from mine. I could see the infinite pain in his lifeless eyes, a pain that cannot be relieved, that cannot be healed, that never ends. "I thought the same," Cain said, and for a moment his expression changed from severity to a sadness so pure that I almost felt pity. "I thought that if Abel wasn't there, God would look at me. I thought if I eliminated the competition, I would be the only one. But when my brother's blood touched the earth opened its mouth to curse me, and now I am here alone, eternally alone with my memory." The word alone echoed in the void like a death sentence. I understood then that Cain's punishment was not fire, nor demons, nor lashes. His punishment was memory. His punishment was reliving, second by second, the exact moment his envy destroyed his life, and his presence there before me was a mirror. I was seeing my future. If I stayed in that place, I would become a smaller version of him. I would spend eternity sitting on a rock of bitterness, remembering my brother's face, remembering the chance I had to embrace him and that I rejected. Cain straightened up and stared toward the dark horizon, as if searching for something he would never find. "They think fire is the worst thing about this place," he muttered almost to himself, "but the real hell is knowing you could have loved and chose to hate. The real hell is knowing the door was open and you locked it yourself." Suddenly, His gaze was fixed on me again, and this time there was a fierce urgency in his eyes, a warning born of millennia of torment. He raised an enormous hand and pointed to my chest, to the place where my physical heart had stopped beating. "You still smell of fresh earth," he said with a strange grimace. "Your sentence isn't written in stone yet, or is it? Have you killed your brother in your mind to the point of no return?" Fear gripped me again, but this time it was a different kind of fear. It wasn't fear of pain, it was fear of becoming him. It was an absolute terror of losing my humanity and becoming a monument to resentment. Cain, the first murderer, stood before me not only as a condemned man, but as a prophecy of what hatred does to the human soul. I realized that my hatred was neither just nor reasonable. My hatred was a seed of this same cursed tree that stands before me. The atmosphere around Cain suddenly shifted and grew even heavier, as if Jupiter's gravity had crushed us to the ground. The mark on his forehead, that pulsating shadow that seemed to have a life of its own, began to glow with a violent, black light, a visible darkness that devoured the meager reddish clarity of hell. I understood with horror that I wasn't going to receive a theological sermon from his mouth, but that I was going to witness his torment in real time. Cain wasn't there merely to suffer passively. His punishment was active, cyclical, and eternal. His eyes unfocused, losing sight of my presence, and fixed on an empty point in the air, filling with a mixture of murderous fury and absolute terror. He began to breathe with difficulty, panting like a cornered animal, and his gigantic hands clenched into fists so tight that his knuckles cracked like dry branches breaking. From the barren, rocky ground in front of us, a pale mist began to rise. It wasn't smoke, it was memory materialized. The mist slowly took shape, forming the figure of a young man. He was a spectral apparition, yet he possessed a disturbing solidity. I could see his kind face, his relaxed posture, the innocence in his look. It was Abel, not the real Abel resting in paradise, but the indelible memory that Cain carried in his tortured conscience. Abel's figure didn't look at me, nor even at Cain, with fear. It was simply there, existing in its final moment, oblivious to the eternity of pain that his death would unleash. Cain let out a guttural growl, a sound that came from the deepest part of his being, laden with an envy as ancient as the world. I saw his body tense, reliving the exact emotion of that fateful day. He crouched slowly, not because he wanted to, but because he was compelled by the curse of his own history, and his fingers grazed a sharp, black stone on the infernal floor. I could see the struggle on his face, a titanic conflict between his present will, which already knew the cost of the crime, and his past will, which was blinded by hatred. His muscles trembled, resisting movement. He sweated drops of black blood, but the script of his sin was stronger. His hand closed around the stone. "No!" Cain screamed in a heart-rending voice, trying to stop his own arm. "Stop, I don't want to do it again." But his arm wouldn't obey him. It rose with supernatural strength, driven by the ghost of his ancient rage. I wanted to close my eyes, I wanted to cover my ears, but I was paralyzed, forced to witness the repetition of the first murder. Cain lunged at his brother's misty figure. The blow was brutal. The stone fell with a dry, final violence. Although Abel was only a projection of memory, the sound of the impact was disgustingly real, a wet crack that made my stomach churn. Abel's figure fell to the ground without a sound, vanishing in wisps of white smoke that blended into the dark floor. What followed was worse than the act of violence. Cain fell to his knees beside the spot where the figure had disappeared. He dropped the stone, which bounced with a hollow sound, and looked at his hands. They were clean, there was no physical blood, but he began to frantically rub them against his thighs, pressed against the earth, against his own chest, screaming that he couldn't wash away the stain. The blood howled, staring at his empty palms with wild eyes. The voice of blood does not fall silent, it screams from the earth. "Silence it, please, someone silence it." He covered his ears and banged his head against the ground, trying to stifle a sound only he could hear. The clamor of divine justice. It was a scene of utter madness. The strong man, the builder of cities, the firstborn of humanity, reduced to a trembling rag by the weight of his own conscience, At that moment, I understood that hell is not just a place of external fire, it is a place where conscience becomes the cruelest executioner. There were no demons torturing Cain at that instant, they weren't needed. He was his own demon. He was his own victim. The cycle of the vision ended as abruptly as it had begun. The black light on his forehead, the light subsided, and Cain lay panting on the ground, exhausted, his gaze lost in nothingness. A few minutes of deathly silence passed before he seemed to remember I was there. He sat up slowly with the movements of an old man and turned to face me. His face had changed again. The fury was gone, replaced by a cold, lucid bitterness. "Did you see it?" he asked me hoarsely. "That is my eternity. There is no rest, no sleep, only the moment of the mistake repeated over and over again forever. Every time I think I have found a moment of peace, the stone appears in my hand." He stared at me and pointed an accusing finger at my chest. "You didn't use a stone," he said, and his words pierced me like needles. "You used silence, you used indifference, you used sharp words in a lawyer's office, but the result is the same. You killed love, and he who kills love kills himself." He took a step toward me, and I felt the chill of his presence envelop me. "Do you know what hurts the most here?" he whispered, bringing his face close to mine until I could see the endless cracks in his skin. "It's not the heat, it's not the thirst, it's knowing that the door of forgiveness was open as long as I breathed. I heard God's voice before I did it. He warned me, he told me, sin is crouching at the door, lurking. It gave me the chance to master it. But I chose my pride, I chose my righteousness, and you did the same. You had years to call your brother, you had 1,000 chances to cast your stone, but you preferred to keep it in your pocket until it weighed you down so much that it dragged you down here." His words were the raw truth. I remembered the times my wife asked me to forgive, the times my mother cried, the times I felt a faint impulse stirred in my heart to set things right, and I crushed it with my pride. I had ignored the warnings just like Cain. "Listen well, lost soul," Cain continued, his voice taking on a prophetic urgency. "Down here, time stands still. There is no tomorrow to set things right. Here, it is always today, always the moment of the crime. If you stay here, your punishment will be to relive that argument in the office for all eternity. You will see your brother's face weeping over your body. You will feel your own hatred burning in your veins, and you will want to scream forgiveness, but you will have no mouth to say it. You will become a broken record of your own sin." The thought of being trapped in that time loop, reliving my death and my hatred eternally, filled me with a dizzying panic. I began to back away from him, shaking my head. "No!" I shouted, finding my voice for the first time in a long time. "I am not like you. I didn't kill him." Cain let out a sad, dry laugh, humorless. He didn't reply. "Look at yourself, look at your hands." I looked down at my spiritual hands. With horror, I saw that they were beginning to change. The once smooth skin was turning grayish and cracked, similar to his. My fingers looked stiff, curled like claws, and on my chest, right where my heart was, a dark stain was beginning to spread, pulsing with the same black rhythm as the mark on Cain's forehead. I was transforming. The atmosphere of hell wasn't just surrounding me, it was invading me. I was becoming what I hated. "The seed has sprouted," Cain said, turning to return to his torment rock. "You are one of us. Welcome to the family of those who never forgive. Welcome to eternal solitude." I watched him walk away, bent over under the weight of his guilt, returning to his original position to await the next repetition of his cycle of horror. I stood alone in the gloom, staring at my deformed hands, feeling the hatred solidify inside me like fresh cement. The despair I felt was unlike anything on earth. It was the absolute certainty that I had thrown away my eternity for a scrap of land and sliver of pride. But then, as terror consumed me, something happened. A laugh, not Cain's, but a crowded laugh, mocking and cruel, coming from all directions. The shadows around me began to stir. The demons who hadn't dared approach Cain were now returning for me. They knew the lesson was over and it was time to take me to my own cell. I saw their yellow eyes gleam in the darkness, circling me, closing the loop. I was trapped, marked, and alone, and for the first time, The wall of my pride crumbled completely, leaving me naked before the truth of my misery. The demons closed the circle around me, but they no longer attacked with claws or fangs. This time their attack was far more sophisticated and cruel. They didn't want to tear at my spiritual flesh yet. They wanted to shatter what little remained of my mind. They moved with a mocking slowness, knowing I had nowhere to run. One of them, a thin, skeletal creature with insect-like eyes and broken wings that dragged along the ground, moved ahead of the rest. In its bony hands, it held something that shone with a dull light in the darkness. It was a fragment of mirror or perhaps a sheet of polished metal, but its surface was as dark as obsidian. It approached me with a crooked smile and held the object in front of my face, forcing me to look. "Look what you've built," she whispered, and her breath smelled of rotten lies. "Look at the masterpiece of your pride." I didn't want to look. I was afraid of what Cain had told me, afraid of confirming that the transformation was real, but I couldn't close my eyes. In hell, curiosity is a mandatory curse. I looked at my reflection in that black surface and screamed. The sound that came from my throat wasn't human, it was a distorted roar, the sound of a wounded beast. What I saw in the mirror wasn't the successful businessman, nor the family man, not even the angry man who died in the office. I saw a monster. My face was deformed by a permanent sneer of contempt. My mouth had stretched and twisted downward, as if the expression of disgust I had worn for years had fossilized in my flesh. My eyes, once brown and lively, were now two black holes without iris or pupil, wells of emptiness that reflected the nothingness inside me. My skin was gray, covered in hard scales that looked like stone crusts, an armor of insensitivity I had fashioned myself so I wouldn't feel compassion. But the most horrible thing was my chest, where my heart should have been. There was an open hole, a dark cavern from which a constant, black smoke billowed. There was no light, no warmth, no life. I had become the physical embodiment of my own resentment. "Do you like it?" the demon mocked, pulling back the mirror and letting out a shrill laugh. "It's a tailor-made suit. You wove it thread by thread every time you refused to greet your brother, every time you felt superior. It fits you perfectly." I fell to my knees, covering my face with my deformed hands, trying to hide my ugliness, but the demons gave me no respite. They began to circle around me, chanting a litany of my failures, but these weren't vague accusations, they were precise, detailed memories, moments I had buried in oblivion that now surfaced with painful clarity. "Do you remember the birthday your nephew?" a voice whispered to my left. Suddenly, the darkness opened, and I saw the scene projected in the air like a holographic film. I saw my brother calling me, inviting me to his 5-year-old son's party. I saw my own face, full of arrogance, telling him I had more important things to do than waste time with hypocrites. I saw the disappointment in my brother's eyes and the sadness of the child asking for his uncle. "You could have gone, you could have eaten cake, you could have laughed, but you chose to stay alone in your office counting money. Where is your money now? It can buy you a glass of water here." "Enough!" I screamed, pounding the floor. "And do you remember when your mother got sick?" Another demon interrupted, projecting another scene. I saw my mother in a hospital bed, weak and pale. I saw myself entering the room, but instead of comforting her, I began complaining that my brother wasn't doing enough, sowing discord. Even on her deathbed, I watched as she closed her eyes, weary of my venom, preferring sleep to avoid hearing me. "You stole her peace in her final days. You turned her farewell into a battlefield. What a great son you were." Every memory was a lash. It wasn't physical pain, it was shame, a burning, corrosive, unbearable shame. I realized that my life had been a succession of open doors, which I had slammed shut. No one had pushed me into hell. I had walked there with a firm step, guided by my own pride. God had placed obstacles in my path, sent me messengers, given me a loving family, but I had leapt over all of that to reach my doom. I was the architect of my own misfortune. Utter despair gripped me. It wasn't just sadness, it was the absolute realization of the finality of my existence. On earth, we always believe there is time. We say, "Tomorrow I'll ask for forgiveness, next week I'll go to church, next year when I'll make things right." We live with the arrogance of believing we own the clock, but there, lying in the dust of the abyss, I understood that the clock had broken. Tomorrow didn't exist. He would have. It's the most tortuous word in the infernal vocabulary. Would have forgiven, would have embraced, would have loved. Those words bounced around in my skull, mocking my stupidity. The demons drew closer, their faces filled with a sadistic pleasure. They began to push me, to poke me, not to kill me, but to humiliate me. They spat on me, and their saliva burned like acid. They told me that my brother, the one I hated so much, was at that very moment praying for me, mourning my death, taking care of my funeral with the respect I didn't deserve. He's buying you a fine wooden coffin, the demon leader mocked me. He's comforting your wife. He's taking care of your children. He's playing the role of father that you left vacant, and you're still here hating him. It's not ironic. He won. He has life, love, peace, and you have nothing. That truth was the final blow. My hatred crumbled, not because I suddenly became good, but because it lost its foundation. My hatred was useless, my envy ridiculous. I had spent my life competing against someone who was never competing with me, someone who only wanted to love me. I felt like the stupidest being in the universe, a cosmic idiot who traded eternal love for a bowl of rotten lentils of pride. I curled up in the fetal position, wishing I could disappear, wishing my soul would be extinguished and cease to exist. But the soul is eternal, it cannot be turned off. I had to endure that awareness, that pain, that reality forever. A million years would pass and I would still be remembering my brother's face and my own stupidity. 10 million years and the pain would be just as fresh. Eternity stretched before me like a black, shoreless ocean, and I was drowning in it, unable to die. I looked around at the shadows, the demons, the red storm sky. There were no angels, no saints, no God. I was in the place where God is not, or rather, where his presence is only fire, consuming and just, but not mercy. I felt abandoned, orphaned of all goodness. The loneliness I felt when I saw Cain was now mine. I was an island of misery in a sea of fire, and then, in the darkest depths of that well of despair, when I had not a drop of pride left, not a shred of self-justification, something broke, definitively, inside me. It wasn't my mind, it was my heart of stone. That hard shell I had built up over the years cracked under the weight of the truth. I saw myself for what I was, a miserable sinner, a man who had failed at the only thing that mattered, which was to love. I no longer cared about money, inheritance, or reason. I just wanted to get out of there. I just wanted one chance, even just one, to say, I'm sorry. The demons, sensing my brokenness, pounced on me for the final torment, ready to drag me back to the valley of the murderers. I felt their claws dig into my back, lifting me up to carry me to my eternal fate. But as they dragged me, as the physical and spiritual pain reached its climax, an immense pressure rose in my throat. It wasn't a cry of fear, it wasn't a cry of pain, it was a cry born of the purest and deepest repentance a soul can experience. It was the total acknowledgement of my failure and the absolute need for a savior. I didn't know if God could hear me from there. I had been told that in hell there are no prayers, that God turns his back on the damned, but my soul paid no heed to theological reasoning. My soul, in its final agony, remembered the name my mother had taught me, the name I had despised, the name above all names, and with the last breath of my consciousness, I decided to use it as my last, desperate letter. I felt my existence was about to be erased or assimilated by the eternal darkness. The demon's claws dug into my spiritual shoulders with brutal possessiveness as they dragged me back to the valley of the murderers. The pain was unbearable, but the fear was worse. I knew where I was going. I was going to join the chorus of haters. I was going to become a blind, rabid beast, fighting forever with shadows. The condemnation echoed in my mind like an irrevocable court sentence. Guilty, guilty of hate, guilty of spiritual murder. The demons laughed, celebrating their victory, mocking my fall. They told me that God doesn't listen to trash, that heaven is closed to those who hold grudges, and they were right. I knew it. Logic said it was too late. Theology said that after death comes judgment. But in that moment of absolute darkness, when I no longer had the strength even to lift my head, something unexpected happened inside me, a memory small and bright, like a spark in the middle of an ocean of oil, ignited in my mind. It wasn't my own thought, it was my mother's voice. I heard it as clearly as if she were whispering in my ear in that cursed place. I remembered an afternoon from my childhood when I came home crying because a friend had betrayed me. She wiped away my tears, looked me in the eyes, and said, "Son, man can fail you, your father can fail you, even you can fail yourself. But there is one name that never fails, and if one day you find yourself at the bottom of the darkest pit where no one can hear you, shout that name, because that name has the authority to break chains that not even death can hold." I had forgotten that advice for 40 years, I had buried it under layers of cynicism, money, and pride, but now, stripped of everything, that was the only coin I had left in the pocket of my soul. The demons must have sensed the change in my spirit because they stopped laughing abruptly. They tightened their claws, trying to cover my mouth, trying to smother the intention that was rising in my chest. "Shut up," one of them shrieked with panic in his voice. "Don't you dare think it, not here, that name is forbidden here." Their fear gave me the confirmation I needed. If they feared that name, then there was still power in it. I tried to speak, but my tongue was stuck to the roof of my mouth, paralyzed by the weight of the infernal atmosphere. The air became as thick as concrete, pressing against my lungs so I couldn't exhale. It was a physical, spiritual battle. He didn't want me to utter the word, but I knew that it wasn't enough to say the name like a magic formula. There had to be truth, there had to be real change. I couldn't ask for salvation if I remained clinging to my hatred. I had to let go of the stone. I had to do what Cain didn't do. I closed my eyes to the darkness and looked inward. I visualized the face of my brother, not the face I hated, but the face of the man who loved me, and in that second of agony, I made the hardest decision of my life. I decided to forgive, not because he deserved it or not, but because I needed to be free. I tore the contract of resentment I had signed with hell. "I forgive him," I screamed mentally, pushing against the invisible gag. "I forgive my brother, I relinquish my right to be angry, I relinquish my pride." As I released the forgiveness, I felt as if a dam had burst inside me. The pressure in my throat eased a millimeter, just enough to let the air out. I gathered every ounce of strength, every scrap of will, every drop of desperate hope I had left, and I let out a scream that tore through the silence of death. I didn't scream for help, I didn't scream for mother, I screamed the name Jesus. The sound of that name wasn't normal. It wasn't an acoustic wave traveling through the air, it was a shock wave. It was as if I had detonated a nuclear bomb of light in the darkness. The word burst from my mouth and reverberated with an authority that wasn't mine. The entire hell seemed to tremble at that vibration. The ground beneath my feet shook violently, the rocks creaked, and a collective howl of pain rose from the valley of the murderers and from every corner of the abyss. The demons holding me did not let go. They were flung out. It was as if they had touched a high-voltage wire. They shrieked in pain, covering their eyes and ears, writhing on the ground like worms exposed to salt. The name of Jesus burned away the atmosphere of evil, disintegrating the authority they had over me. And then the miracle happened. The ceiling of black clouds and sulphurous smoke split in two. It didn't open slowly, it tore open violently. A beam of light descended from above, a column of purity so white and brilliant that my eyes couldn't process it, but my soul drank it in desperately. It wasn't a cold light like that of lamps, nor hot like that of fire. It was a living light. It was love condensed into divine photons. The light struck the place where I was kneeling, creating a circle of protection around me. Within that circle, the infernal heat vanished instantly, replaced by a peace that surpassed all understanding. The smell of rot and sulfur disappeared, and in its place I perceived a scent of life, of fresh flowers, of clean rain. I felt small, dirty, and unworthy, but at the same time I felt immensely loved. I lifted my radiant face and knew that he was there. I didn't see a human face with a beard and robe, I saw a presence. I felt a majesty so great it made me tremble, not from fear, but from absolute reverence. "Lord, I am face down to the ground, bathed in that blessed light. I am a murderer. I killed my brother in my heart. I deserve to be here. I deserve the fire. But I beg you, I plead with you by your blood, have mercy on this fool. I expected a rebuke. I expected him to tell me, it's too late. But what I heard wasn't a voice in Spanish. It was a direct communication to my spirit, faster than thought. I felt a wave of compassion wash over me from within. I felt him take my confession, my repentance, and my forgiveness of my brother, and accept them as a valid offering. Because you forgave, you are forgiven. The truth resonated within me. I felt a hand. It wasn't a physical hand, but it was more tangible than anything I had ever touched. It gripped my wrist, not violently like the demons, but with a sure and powerful firmness. I felt an upward pull, an ascending force that defied the gravity of sin. My feet lifted from the rocky ground of hell. The demons, recovering from the initial shock, tried to come back for me. I saw their shadows stretching out, their claws trying to grab my ankles, screaming that I belonged to them, that I was the property of hatred. I even heard a distant roar, perhaps from Cain himself, furious at losing a fellow sufferer, but the light that enveloped me was an impenetrable wall. Nothing filthy could touch me while I was in its hand. I began to rise, the speed increased, the nightmarish landscape, the valley of the tortured, the solitary figure of Cain, everything below shrank, becoming mere specks in the darkness until they vanished. I passed through the layers of darkness, rising higher and higher, moving away from the stench of death. I felt my spiritual body being restored, the scales of hatred fell away, a hole in my chest closed, filling again with the capacity to feel. I was going back, I didn't know where, whether to heaven or earth, but I knew I had been rescued from the lion's mouth. The feeling of gratitude was so immense that I felt my heart would burst. I had been dead, I had been condemned, I had seen the face of the first murderer, and yet, by a single cry of faith and an act of genuine forgiveness, the hand of God had pulled me out of the pit. The light grew brighter and brighter until everything turned white, an absolute white that erased any trace of pain, and then I felt a sharp blow, a brutal jolt that was not spiritual but physical. Cold, painful air rushed in, a blow to lungs that had been collapsed. The impact back into my body was violent, as if I had been dropped from a 10th floor straight onto a concrete slab. Physical pain assaulted me immediately, an avalanche of sharp sensations that made my back arch in an involuntary spasm. I felt as if 1,000 needles were piercing my chest at once and my ribs were cracking under immense pressure. I opened my mouth to scream, but what came out was a hoarse, desperate gasp, the sound of a man drowning who suddenly finds the surface. Air entered my lungs burning like liquid fire, expanding alveoli that had been collapsed and dead. My eyes snapped open, wide in shock. The white light I had seen at the end of my spiritual ascent transformed into the harsh, fluorescent light of a hospital lamp. I blinked frantically, trying to focus as my brain attempted to process the impossible transition between hell and earth. The first thing I heard wasn't the wails of the damned, but the rhythmic, frantic beeping of a heart monitor beside me, registering a rapid, chaotic pulse. There were voices around me. Urgent human voices, shouting medical orders, calling for epinephrine, preparing defibrillators. "We have a pulse," someone yelled in disbelief. "We got him back. My God, he's back." I felt hands on me, warm hands of doctors and nurses, adjusting oxygen masks, checking IVs. The smell of alcohol and disinfectant filled my nose, and for the first time in my life, that clinical smell,